Hi, my name is Everett. Today I am reading Who is Steve Irwin? Who is Steve Irwin? When Steve Irwin was a boy, he followed his father everywhere. He had so many questions. His dad thought Steve's mind might explode. Why is that snake hissing? How come that gecko's tail is missing? Do crocodiles cry crocodile tears? Steve's father, Bob, was a reptile expert. He knew more about snakes and lizards and crocodiles than most other people in Australia. He had no trouble answering Steve's questions. Snakes hiss to scare away predators, he'd say. Geckos shed their tails so they won't get caught. Crocodiles make tears to cleanse their eyes. They really don't cry. When Steve was 9, his father took him to the wilderness to catch his first crocodile. Steve's question changed. Steve, why do you capture crocodiles, Bob? To move them to a safe place where people won't kill them. Steve, why do people kill them? Bob, because they're afraid. Steve, why are they afraid? Bob, because they don't understand them. Steve Irwin never stopped asking questions. When he grew up, he searched for answers by himself. He found them everywhere, on the branches of a mango tree, inside a kangaroo's pouch, beside a riverbank. Before long, Steve knew so much that a TV station asked him to share what he had learned. His show was called The Crocodile Hunter. Steve's audience grew, first in Australia, then all over the world. He took viewers along as he explored the wildlife he loved. He noticed everything. Every little snake was gorgeous. Every crocodile was a little beauty. People started looking at wildlife differently. They were curious now. They weren't as afraid anymore. Steve Irwin spent his life trying to protect the wildlife. Like his father, he continued to teach others. Steve never lost that excitement he felt when he was a child. Cricky, he would whisper to the camera when he'd spotted another gorgeous creature, but he also never forgot what Bob had told him. Careful, mate, he would add. Danger, danger, danger. Chapter 1. Snakes and Joeys. February 22nd, 1962 was a big day for Lynn Irwin. It was her 20th birthday. It was also the day that her second child and first son was born. Steve Robert Irwin was born in a small town called Upper Florentine, Gully near Melbourne. By the time Steve was a year old, he was scurrying toward the front door. There was so much to explore. As they hurried to catch up with him, Lynn and Bob Irwin knew they were in for a wild adventure. Steve's older sister, Joy, knew it too. She was old enough to understand that she'd better remember to close all the doors everywhere, or his new little brother of hers would go missing again. To Steve, the world outside the house was a wonderland. Steve's father was a very successful plumber, but more than anything, Bob Irwin loved snakes and other reptiles. Steve was a curious child. He wanted to play with his father's snakes. Australia. Australia is the only country in the world that is also a continent. It is the smallest continent and the 16th largest country. Sixth largest country. This English-speaking country is surrounded by water. The Pacific Ocean is on the east. The Indian Ocean is on the west. Australia's largest cities are Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide. They are all near the ocean. Much of Australia's middle is a dry and remote desert area called the outback. Snakes can be very dangerous. Bob would say, some snakes will not hurt you, but some are poisonous, like the brown tiger and taipan snakes that live in the woods. Poisonous snakes shoot venom through their fangs when they bite. Snakes don't like to be disturbed. It scares them, so stay back. The world inside Steve's house was also pretty interesting. Steve's mother was trained as a nurse. She had cared for newborn babies. Lynn Irwin loved babies, all kinds of them. She loved them as much as her husband loved snakes and lizards and plants. Sometimes Lynn and Steve would spot an injured kangaroo or koala or possum lying by the side of the road. Lynn would stop the car and take the animal home. She would also check to see if there was a baby in the mother's pouch. Baby kangaroos, koalas, wallabies, and possums are called joeys. Steve's first playmates were joeys. As Steve grew older, he obeyed his father's warnings about snakes and other dangerous animals. He stood back instead of trying to grab at the snake. He watched how Bob gently handled the reptiles with love and respect. When Bob went into the woods to look for snakes and lizards, Steve came along. Bob pointed at all kinds of wildlife. He explains how frogs were disappearing because of the water pollution. They need help or soon they might become extinct. There would be no more of them. People were clearing the land and cutting down trees. Beautiful birds were losing their homes. When they went out to see the crocodiles, Steve moved close to the riverbank. These were freshwater crocs, Bob would say. They live in rivers and creeks where the water is fresh, not salty. Saltwater crocs live in salty oceans. Sometimes they wander into freshwater. Salties are much bigger and more dangerous than freshies. Bob never seemed frightened of the wildlife he loved, but sometimes he sounded angry. People wanted to kill these beautiful crocs and snakes and lizards. Poachers shot them and sold their skins to people who made shoes and handbags. When Steve was 6 years old, his father gave him a 20-foot python. Pythons do not produce venom, so they are not poisonous. Pythons kill their prey by squeezing them. They can be dangerous too. Bob taught Steve how to be very careful. Steve loved his new pet. He held it gently like his mother had done when she cared for his sick and injured baby animals. In the evenings, Bob and Lynn would talk about how they wished that they could spend their time caring for wildlife. There were 3 children now: Joy, Steve, and the new baby Mandy. The Irwins discussed buying some land near the ocean. They could work together as a family. Bob would be able to spend time with the reptiles. Lynn would have more room to care for baby animals. Together they would teach about Australia's wildlife. They would create a park. People would pay to see the animals. The more they talked, the more excited they became. They would live in a trailer while they built a house. Bob was a good builder. He'd helped build houses before. Bob drew up plans for the houses in the park. Lynn was in charge of the money. The year of 1970, Steve Irwin was 8 years old. The Irwins came to a decision. Now was the time they followed their dreams. Chapter 2. Growing Up in the Zoo. Burwa, Queensland seemed like the perfect place to build a reptile park. Burwa was in one of the most Australia's beautiful areas. The Sunshine Coast, tourists flocked to the areas, especially in the summer. The Pacific Ocean was about 20 minutes drive away. The Glass Home and House Mountains were 50 minutes to the south. People from all over the world came to hike there. To the west and south, forests and rivers where snakes slithering and crocodiles basked in the sun. The city of Brisbane was an hour south. The Irwins bought 4 acres of land, parked their small RV trailer, and tried to settle in. Living in a trailer was cramped, to say the least. 2 adults, 3 kids, snakes and baby animals, and everything the family owned. Bob went to work and shed in some reptile enclosures. Soon the Irwins' new life began to seem normal. The family belongings were in the shed. Many of the reptiles were in their homes of their own. Bob and Lynn were beginning to live their dreams. It would take time to build the perfect house, but no one seemed to mind. Living in the RV was fun. The RV would be their new home for 2 years. Every morning, Steve would dress in his school uniform for land sport. State school. The school was not far from their new home, but Steve was often late. Lynn was always ready. Joy and Mandy were ready too. Steve was ready, but no one could ever find him. While Lynn and the girls waited in the car, Bob searched the woods and called Steve's name. Where was Steve? Out exploring. There was so much to discover. In this exciting new world, trees were filled with laughing kookaburras and other birds, streams alive with fish and snakes. By the end of 1970, the Burrawea Park was up and running. Bob and Lynn placed ads in the local paper. Reporters wrote newspapers, articles. People came to the park and told their friends about it. Tourists arrived. More enclosures were built. The zoo was growing. At last, the Irwins were making money doing what they loved. The bush. Australia's river to areas away from the towns and cities as the brush. People go to the bush to keep away from crowds and noise. They camp in the woods beneath mango trees. They listen to the birds and see fish in clear water. But cities are growing larger. Politicians and land clearing are pushing the bush farther and farther away. Bob was spending more and more time in the bush, studying wildlife. Kangaroos hopped through the forest. Koalas looked down from eucalyptus trees. At the riverbank, he watched the freshwater crocodiles move slowly through the water. When Steve wasn't at school, he went with his father. Sometimes he noticed that a croc was sick. Sometimes they thrashed angrily. Steve heard bulldozers in the distance. Bob explained that the noise upset the crocs. Nearby, land was being cleared for new buildings. The water was becoming polluted. The crocodile's home was changing. That was why they were getting sick. Bob and Steve wanted to rescue the crocs. Bob knew that they were in danger of being killed. If land was being cleared, a golf course or home wasn't far behind. Bob knew that many people didn't want crocs nearby. They were afraid. Some people were shooting the crocs, but the crocs were afraid too. Intruders were disturbing their homes. Bob decided to move the crocs to new areas where the water was clean and the crocs would be safe. But first he would have to find a way to care for the sick crocs. He would build a safe place in the park. Sick and injured crocs would stay until they were well enough to be returned to the wildlife. As Steve watched from a distance, Bob used mesh netting to capture the crocs. Bob explained the crocs hated to be disturbed, but they calmed down if their eyes were covered. He taught Steve how to make a hood blindfold. He showed him how to tie up the croc's jaws so he couldn't bite. Sometimes when the croc was secure and wrapped in mesh, Steve helped him and his dad to the truck and for the trip back to the park. Steve and Bob built larger enclosures for the crocs. They filled the ponds with clean, healthy water for the crocs after the crocs were well again. Bob and Steve returned many to the wild, but some remained in the park. Bob loved telling people about the wildlife in his park. Before long, the word was out. Bob Irwin was well known as an expert on snakes. No, he was talking about crocs too. Croc facts. Crocodiles and alligators are prehistoric animals. Like dinosaurs, dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago, but somehow crocs and gators survived. Crocodiles are not the same as alligators. Crocodiles live mainly in the Africa, Australia, Indian, and South America. Most alligators live in the southern United States and China. Crocodiles are generally larger than alligators. Some are 20 feet long and weigh 2,000 pounds. Crocodiles have pointed V-shaped snouts. Alligators have round U-shaped snouts. Crocodiles always show some of their bottom teeth. An alligator's bottom teeth cannot be seen when its mouth is closed. Crocodiles sweat through their mouths. That's why their mouths are always open. Saltwater crocodiles are sometimes called salties. Freshwater crocodiles are called freshies. Freshies are smaller than salties. Chapter 3. Catching Crocs. One day when Steve was 9, Bob heard that land was being cleared to the north. Dams were being built. The fish and reptiles that lived in the river were disturbed by the explorations. The crocodiles were frightening the workers. Bob knew that there was a chance the croc would be shot. He decided to head up the river and see what he could do. Steve wanted to go, but there was the problem of school. Nevertheless, Steve had made up his mind. He was going with his father, and that was that. If it looked like I wasn't going to go on a field trip, I'd roll around on the ground and wave my arms in the air, he said later. Bob enjoyed having Steve with him, but he had a problem too. Crocs can be dangerous, especially saltwater crocs. Bob made a decision. Steve wasn't going anywhere until he had a good long talk. Saltwater crocs are known as killing machines. They will eat anything: horses, cows, wild pigs, and small or lovely excited boys who aren't being careful. Freshwater crocs eat fish and insects most of the time. Flashies aren't usually interested in humans, but they will bite when they're upset. A croc's hearing is sensitive. Loud noises like explosions, bulldozers, and noisy boys terrify them. Crocs don't know when people are trying to save their lives. They'll thrash and fight if someone tries to trap them. Bob had always taught Steve to be calm and silent around the crocs, but it was hard for Steve. He could barely sit still. When Bob said he could come along, Steve jumped up and raced around the house. Maybe Bob would let him catch a freshie, wrap it up, and put it in the boat. He'd watched his father do it enough times. The next day, Bob and Steve packed up their trucks and headed toward the North River. Steve begged to catch a croc. This time, Bob agreed. Catching crocs is the best done at night. When the river is dark, the croc's eyes gleam bright like a shiny red reflection road sign. Bob and Steve waited. Finally, it was time. Steve climbed into the front of their diney. Bob sat in the back, holding their flashlights. They drifted slowly through the murky water. "There's one!" Steve gasped. Bob and Steve peered into the water and studied the croc's head. It was small. A small head meant that Steve could catch it. The croc was probably no more than 5 feet long. Bigger than that was too dangerous for a 9-year-old. The croc was definitely a freshie. "I can catch this little beauty," Steve told Bob. He put his flashlight down and leaned over. A moment later, Steve flew off the boat and scrambled into the croc's back. Its tail thrashed. Even so, Steve managed to wrap it between his legs and hang on tight. The croc wasn't as small as Steve had thought. This little beauty was as big as Steve. As the croc struggled to get free, Bob tossed his light aside and reached out. One arm grabbed Steve, the other snatched up the croc. They landed in the boat together, croc and boy. The blindfold and ropes came out. The jaws were secure. Later, as they moved the croc to a safer part of the river, away from the explosions, Steve felt good. He had done it. He had captured his first crocodile. He had relocated it. He had been excited and fun. The croc was safe now. People would not hurt it. On that day, Steve Irwin knew that no matter what happened, he was going to spend his life saving these amazing reptiles. Australia wildlife. Platypuses and mixed mammals. It has a duck's bill and webbed feet, a beaver's tail, and an otter's body. Males shoot venom out through their heels. Dingo, a wild dog that sometimes travels in packs. Koala, cute little animals that enjoy hanging out in eucalyptus trees. They are not bears. Koalas carry babies in their pouches and are therefore marsupial mammals. Laughing kookaburra, a kingfisher bird. They make loud laughing bird calls. Numbat, a banded anteater. Tasmanian devil, an angry teeth-bearing marsupial, almost all known now live on the island of Tasmania, south of Australia. Wallaby, similar to but smaller than their Australian kangaroo cousins. Wombat, another pouched marsupial. They are nocturnal and spend their nights digging burrows and eating grass and bark. Chapter 4. Surfing with Salties. As Steve grew older, Bob began to depend on him to help save trouble freshies, snakes, and lizards. Sometimes they stayed in the bush for days, sleeping under the stars, tracking and capturing problem crocs. As Steve grew, so did the crocs as he allowed to capture. Steve was different than most of the kids in his school. While he was out catching crocs, other boys were playing rugby, soccer, and cricket. At Steve's home, there were lizards and crocs to feed and snakes to play with. As the park expanded, there were bigger and better enclosures to help build. Lynn needed help with the baby possum, koala, kangaroo, birds, and lizards. Why would anyone want to play sports after school when they could be doing this? Steve asked himself. But there was one sport he loved almost as much as he loved catching crocs: surfing. By the time he was in high school, Steve was a great surfer. Steve attended Calandra State High School. The school was about a half hour from his house, but it was a short 5-mile drive from one of the best surfing beaches. Steve began to spend more and more time surfing. By the time Steve finished high school in 1979, the Burwa Reptile Park was overflowing with all kinds of wildlife. Poisonous and non-poisonous snakes wrapped around tree branches, lizards and chameleons skittered past Lynn's, kangaroos, koalas, and baby birds. There was so much to do. When he was home, Steve helped his little sister collect money from the people who came to see the reptiles. He showed the visitors how to feed the crocodiles and other reptiles. He tried to answer their questions. As for Bob Irwin, he was becoming well known. Articles about his talks at the park were printed in newspapers all over the area. Bob believed that education was the best way to help people understand the wildlife he loved. Once they came to know crocs and snakes, they wouldn't fear them. They wouldn't shoot them. In time, people from all over the world came to hear Bob talk. The money the visitors paid was put back into the park. In 1982, the Irwins bought 4 acres next to the park. Bob and Steve worked the land together. They dug holes, they put up fences. Now the crocs were safe and other wildlife. They had more room to wander safely. The park was overflowing with all kinds of Australian wildlife. Newspapers called it one of the area's best places to visit. In 1980, the Burwa Reptile Park became the Queensland Reptile and Fauna Park. Steve was 20 years old. He had been working at home with his parents. Now he was itching to get back to the bush. There were crocs in trouble that needed to be relocated. Bob was ready too. Visitors to the park had been asking about the dangerous saltwater crocs that had been moved into the rivers and creeks up north. I read that they eat people, the visitor said. They're gigantic. I'm afraid to get near the water. They should be shot. Bob tried to explain that these creatures had been around for more than 100 million years, longer than the dinosaurs. Somehow they had managed to survive. Until now, people wanted to wear croc shoes, he said. They wanted to carry crocodile purses, so they shoot these magnificent reptiles for their skin. If something isn't done, saltwater will become extinct. The Australian government had placed a saltwater crocodile on the endangered species list. Killing crocs meant heavy fines or even prison, but saltwater were being shot. Until now, Steve had spent most of his time trying to save and relocate freshwater crocs. Now he wanted to find a way to save the salties. In 1985, Steve heard that the government was setting up the East Coast Crocodile Magnet program to control the salties problems. Steve and Bob signed on as volunteers. From then on, they would spend their time capturing and relocating nuisance Australian saltwater crocs. The salties they couldn't relocate would be brought back to the park. Chapter 5, Wildlife Warrior. In 1985, Steve Irwin met a boy who would become his best mate for the rest of his life. Steve was home from the bush helping out at the park when Was Mania stopped by with his family. Wes was 14. He was 8 years younger than Steve, but that didn't matter to either of them. Snakes mattered. Crocodiles mattered. Possum joeys mattered. Just like Steve, Wes loved animals and wanted to learn. He asked Bob if he could help out after school on the weekends. The park was bigger now. There were plenty to do. Wes was ready for any kind of work. Cleaning, building, caring for the animals, anything as long as he could be around wildlife. It wasn't long before Wes was spending almost all his time at the park. Whenever he could, he'd stop by and stop what he was doing and join the crowd for one of Bob's talks. Before long, Wes was a member of the family. Visitors thought he was Steve's little brother. That was just fine with Steve. Now there was the three of them, Bob, Steve, and little brother Wes, catching freshies. This time, Wes sat in the front of the dinghy, holding the flashlight, looking at head size. Then finally, he leaped into the dark water and trapped his first croc. Sometimes Wes also went along when Steve and Bob were going to relocate the salties. In 1987, Bob decided that they needed more room in the park for saltwater crocs that couldn't be relocated. Every day he heard that of another salty in danger of being killed. He would build a large area in the park to house these salties. Everybody went to work. Before long, the Crocodile Environmental Park was ready. Wes stayed behind to help with the new salties that Steve brought home. In 1988, Wes was working at the park full-time. Steve loved going up north with Bob, but the park was growing fast and Bob needed to stay at home. Steve decided to stay up in the bush. He loved camping along beside the rivers and creeks. He loved it all. Locating a rugged salty, building a net trap, wrestling a huge angry croc in a dinghy, hoisting it into his truck and into a crate, moving it to a safer place, saving its life. It was an awesome job. At home, he tried to explain his experience, but no one could really understand him. Nobody but Bob and Wes. Bob decided Steve needed a video camera. Steve began talking to the camera like he was telling a friend all about his life in the wild. Sometimes his little sister Mandy would come along and be his camera woman. Tricky, he'd whisper as he wrapped the jaws of the thrashing salty. What a little beauty, he'd say, pointing the camera at a burrowing wombat. Danger, danger, he cried as he saw an eastern brown snake happened by. Steve started thinking about teaching like Bob. There was so much information to share about the Australian wildlife he saw in the bush. Dingoes and wild pigs and salties and wallabies. Sometimes at night when the mosquitoes were bad or the rain was pounding outside his tent, he'd think it might be nice to have a friend, someone to talk to about all the fantastic things he'd learned that day. Maybe he could get a dog. Steve first heard about Suey on December 25th, 1988. It was Christmas Day. A new Staffordshire Bull Terrier had just been born. Steve decided this was the dog he wanted. He named her Suey. That would go up in the bush together and sleep under the stars. But first, there were a few things Suey would have to learn, like how to avoid snakes, how to stay back when Steve was busy with a hungry crocodile, how to avoid being eaten when chasing a wild pig, and how to keep very, very quiet. Suey arrived at the park 6 weeks later. Steve started training her right away. When she was ready, Steve let her to the truck. Suey hopped in the front seat and looked up at Steve. That night, they slept in Steve's sleeping bag together. The next evening, they searched for a radio salty. Suey was worried when Steve jumped into the water and crept up behind the enormous croc, but she stayed in the boat. She didn't bark. Soon Suey was helping Steve confuse the crocs. When Steve was about to capture the croc, he would throw a stick. Suey was a great swimmer, and she would race for it. The croc would watch Suey swim toward the stick. That would give Steve time to blindfold the croc and secure its jaws. Suey loved helping Steve. Every time she saw Steve with his sleeping bag, she hopped in the front of the seat of the truck and barked. Soon they would be off together, Suey and her best pal, Steve. Steve thought he'd stay in the bush forever until he met a man who changed his life. Irwin's turtle. One day in the early 1990s, Steve and Bob were fishing in the river with Stewie. They noticed a snapping turtle with a white head and a pink nose swimming nearby. Steve and Bob moved closer and examined the turtle. No one had ever seen a turtle like this one. The turtle was named Was Irwin, or Irwin snapping turtle. Chapter 6. The Crocodile Hunter. John Staton was a filmmaker. One day he stopped by to make a TV commercial in Irwin's Park. He was filming the animals. Steve was home for a visit. He was showing visitors how they fed the crocs. John was amazed. When the show was over, John and Steve talked for a long time. John asked what it was like catching crocs. Steve gave him some of the films he'd shot in the bush. John put the films away and made his commercial. When he took them out again, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The croc was terrifying to John, but Steve didn't seem at all afraid. "Quicky," Steve would saying, "this little beauty sure is hungry." John couldn't believe how excited Steve was about the croc. This guy really thought a croc was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He was waving his arms around and making all kinds of strange animal sounds. Gorgeous was one of Steve's favorite words. Everything seemed gorgeous to him. The croc's razor-sharp teeth, glistening teeth were gorgeous. Its slashing tail was gorgeous. Steve Irwin's life seemed to be one great, gorgeous adventure. John watched the raw videos over and over. An idea was bubbling in his brain. He called Steve. Would Steve mind if he showed the films to Australia's Channel 10 network? "Cricky," Steve said. The producer at Channel 10 were as amazed by the films as John had been. They loved the way Steve looked right into the camera when he explained things. They loved how excited he got when he talked to the animals. They all saw that what a great teacher this guy was. "It's time to get to work," John told Steve. The producer went 10 one-hour episode. They wanted it just like the ones you filmed with your own cameras, up close and personal. But Steve had other things to think about. He had taken over the park in the year before, and it was more popular than ever. He had been adding more and more land to the animals. His parents, Bob and Lynn, were retired to Rosedale, a small town farther north. But most important of all, Steve had met a perfect woman. Terry Raines visited the park in October 1991. She was there to check out the wildlife Terry loved in America and Egan, Oregon, and was touring Australia to learn about the animals that lived there. Steve was showing visitors how the crocs in the park were fed. Terry was fascinated. Steve and Terry came from different worlds, yet as they talked, they realized their backgrounds were very similar. Like Lynn Irwin, Terry's father couldn't pass by an injured animal on the side of the road. Like Lynn, he'd care for them at home. When they were better, he'd release them into the wild. Terry loved animals as much as his father did. When she grew up, she started a clinic called a Sugar Country that cared for injured wild wombats and other animals. Steve and Terry talked so much that Stewie began to bark and whine. Steve and Terry knew that she was jealous and tried to comfort her, but Stewie wasn't having it, at least at first. Terry left Australia shortly after meeting Steve, but she returned 4 months later. Soon Terry and Steve were talking about getting married. On June 4th, 1992, Steve married Terry in Egan, Oregon. Then it was back to work. Steve was anxious to get started on the TV show. John was making plans. Everyone wanted Terry to be in it too. It would be up to Steve and Terry and Steve. Terry wondered what she was getting herself into, but she was ready for anything. It was all so exciting. They'd spent time in the bush. She'd learned about poisonous snakes. She'd help Steve capture a croc. They'd take Stewie along. Stewie and Terry were friends now. A honeymoon for the Irwins would have to wait. Chapter 7. Fame and Fortune. Australia's Channel 10 began showing the 10 episodes in 1992. They called this program The Crocodile Hunter. 5 years later, in 1997, the Animal Planet Network aired the first episode in the United States. It wasn't long before The Crocodile Hunter was being watched all around the world. Eventually, the audience would rise to 500 million viewers in more than 100 countries. Steve and Terry were famous. Steve wasn't sure how he felt about that. He had never been interested in fame. Sometimes he missed his privacy. All Steve had ever wanted was to help people understand the wildlife he loved. But there were good things about fame. He could learn and teach as he traveled the world in search of exciting new wildlife. He could introduce viewers an endangered species. He could help them understand why caring for wildlife was so important. Maybe he could take them to one of the tiny Komodo dragon parks island in Indonesia. He could introduce the viewers to the largest, most dangerous lizard in the world. Komodo dragons are huge. Many grow to be almost 10 feet long. Komodo dragons look like dinosaurs, but they are actually lizards. They will eat almost anything. They have lurked around the Indonesias for millions of years. Steve arranged to travel to Komodo National Park to shoot an episode, The Crocodile Hunter. As the boat approached, a Komodo dragon on the dock greeted the team. Visitors to the park must travel around the park ranger for their own safety, but Steve and his crew were allowed to roam and film on their own. Gigantic Komodo dragons were everywhere, strutting, nipping, whipping their tails at Steve, strolling through the mangroves, hunting for wild pigs. Komodo dragons, look with a fish-like hook in his throat, thought Steve was dinner as he tried to remote it. Danger, 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 Steve announced as he scrambled up a tree. The lizards tried to get him, but Steve escaped. Another dragon was swimming toward a nearby island in search of goats. Commotion in the ocean, Steve said. The episode, Steve and the Dragon, aired in the Animal Planet Network in 1999. As Steve's reputation grew, it seemed like more and more people needed him. One day, a call came in from Florida. The United States Air Force had a problem. Could Steve help? England Air Force Base in the northern Florida. Their training ground was scrawled with rattlesnakes. How could rangers practice parachuting when the place was filled with pigeon rattlers, water moccasins, and other dangerous snakes? The officers had heard that Steve Irwin knew more about snakes than almost anyone. Steve couldn't wait to go. There were so many things that excited him about visiting Florida. He could tell the rangers and views all the things he'd learned from Bob. How to tell the difference between poisonous and non-poisonous snakes. How to spot them before they spot you. Venom in a rattlesnake's fangs might kill you. How to keep yourself and the snake safe. Maybe he would spot some of Florida's gorgeous and endangered species like the tiny silent burrowing owl and the gopher tortoise. The rangers didn't just have to worry about snakes. They had to deal with alligators too. Steve would teach them how to capture and move the alligators to a safe place outside of the training area. Steve and the rangers worked hard to remove the dangerous snakes. The rangers were careful to protect the habitat. Finally, the rattlesnakes and the alligators had been moved. It was time to go home. Steve was excited to get back to the zoo. Steve and Terry's family were growing. Their first child had been born on July 24th, 1998. Her name was Bindi Sue Irwin. Bindi after one of Steve's favorite crocodiles, Sue after Suey, his favorite dog. Chapter 8, Diary of a Zoo. At the zoo was busier than ever. The Crocodile Hunter series had made Steve and Terry very, very famous. Viewers in America, England, and other countries wanted to visit the zoo. They wanted to meet Harriet, the 170-year-old tortoise. They wanted to watch the staff feed some of the most famous saltwater crocs, Argo, Graham, and the oldest croc, Akko. They knew Steve's daughter, Bindy, had been named after a croc. They wanted to meet the super croc. The Animal Planet Network had an idea. They would film a news show all about at the zoo. Fans of Steve and Terry could meet the family and the animals. The Crocodile Hunter Diaries began filming in 1998. It was shown on the Animal Planet from 2002 to 2004. Now the viewers on the other side of the world could watch Wes and Terry move loghead turtles back into the wild. They could see a python shed its skin. The Australia zoo staff all wore khaki shorts just like Steve. Viewers at home got to know them. They watched the vets care for sick kangaroos. They learned about magpies and red foxes. They met two-headed snakes. They followed Bindy as she helped operate on a hawk. Steve was always busy. There were crocs to feed and other animals to attend. He talked to his parents often. He called for advice when there was a problem at the zoo. Bob and Lynn were always available to help out. But then on February 2000, Steve got a terrible call. His mother, Lynn Irwin, had been killed in a car accident. It was a terrible time for the Irwin family. But by 2003, there was good news. Terry was going to have another baby. The Irwins welcomed Robert Clarence Irwin on December 1st, 2003. He was named after Steve's dad, Bob, and Terry's dad, Clarence. Now, Bindy had a little brother. Viewers all over the world were able to meet him. Calls continued to come in from all over places. Please come, we need help. Steve and Terry couldn't wait to go back on the road. It wasn't long before the whole family was driving out on the bush or flying to America or faraway lands. Niue is a tiny island in the South Pacific Ocean. It is one of 83 islands in the country of Vanuatu. When the Vanuatu government called Steve didn't hesitate. A huge salt sea was terrifying the island people of Maui. One of the most beautiful islands in the South Pacific. The crocodile was 12 feet long and about 660 pounds. It was eating their pets. Fishermen were afraid to go out into the sea. Children no longer played on the beaches. Steve and his team arrived in Niue in early 2003. The staff of Vanuatu Environment Unit thought the croc came from an island called Vanuatu. Far to the north, a powerful hurricane must have blown the super croc away from its home. Steve understood the problem. The people of Niue needed to be protected, but this creature was an endangered species. Everyone wanted to save it. No one wanted to be hurt, though. This salty needed help to find its way home. First, Steve and the crew would have to capture it, but how? Tricky, Steve thought. This wasn't going to be easy. Steve and his crew built a strong floating trap. Out of lightweight aluminum, the trap was lowered into the bottom of the ocean and attached to a pyrocoast. Bait was placed in the trap. When the croc swam in it, the trap gate closed. Then Steve pulled the croc to the beach and trapped its legs. The islanders jumped back. Steve secured its jaws and wrapped it in the net. The islanders moved closer. They peered down at the croc. They touched it. They were beginning to understand the crocs they feared. They weren't as scared anymore. Steve was happy. The Crocodile Hunter Diaries camera crew was filming. Viewers would see how important it was to find ways for humans and wildlife to share the planet. A plane took the croc back to its home. Steve and his crew released it in the perfect environment, far from the villages. The islanders' people cheered. Their old friend was back where it belonged and where it was safe. Chapter 9, A Terrible Accident. In 2005, the Discovery of Kids channel wanted Bundy to have her own show. Like Steve, she had grown up in a zoo. She knew almost as much about animals as Steve did. Bundy wanted to do it. She was excited to teach kids to love animals. Steve and Terry agreed. Bundy, the Jungle Girl, began filming in 2006. Bundy was 8 years old. On the show, she lived in a jungle treehouse filled with snakes and birds and all kinds of Australian animals. Sometimes Steve and Terry came to visit. Sometimes her little brother, Robert, joined her. Bundy and Steve took viewers to the United States to meet some of American animals. They went to Africa to learn about lions. When they weren't traveling, Bundy explored the zoo. Wes was the manager now. He became part of the show too. Bundy introduced the zoo animals. She pointed out all the gorgeous changes that were taking place. Viewers watched hundreds of birds in the rainforest aviary that attended croc shows in the new 5,500-seat croc zoo. They learned about crocs, birds, snakes, and other animals. They visited Steve's beloved new wildlife hospital, built in the honor of his mother, Lynn. Bundy explained that volunteer wildlife Warriors. In 2002, Steve and Terry started a group called Wildlife Warriors to help people around the world find ways to rescue wildlife. Wildlife Warriors help save animals during hurricanes and tsunamis, earthquakes, and other natural disasters. Like Steve, warriors wear khaki. Khaki clothes help show that they are working together to save wildlife in their habitats. Wildlife warriors educate people all over the globe. They raise money to buy and preserve land for the animals they love. When Steve wasn't helping Bundy, he was working on a new TV document, Ocean's Deadliest, starred Stephen Philip Custue Jr. Stephen Phillip introduced viewers to the great white shark, the blue-ringed octopus, and the box jellyfish, and other dangerous creatures in the South Pacific Ocean. On September 4th, 2006, Steve and Phillip were filming on Steve's boat around Australia's Great Barrier Reef. The weather turned too dark to film in deep water. Steve decided to do some shallow water filming. Steve got into a blow-up dinghy. Justin Lyons, one of the cameramen, went with him. Near the shore, they noticed a huge 8-foot wide stingray. They decided to film it. Stingrays are usually very calm creatures, but if a ray feels threatened, it will attack with its stinger on its tail. Some massive stingrays have stingers up to 14 inches long. Steve and Justin got into the water. Stephen was behind the stingray. Justin was filming from the front. Suddenly, the ray raised its tail and started stabbing at Steve with its stinger. One of the strikes pierced Steve's heart. At first, Justin didn't realize how badly Steve was hurt. He placed him in the dinghy and raced for help, but there was nothing anyone could do. Steve Irwin died quickly. He was 44 years old. The next day, newspapers all over the world announced that the crocodile hunter had died. Fans everywhere mourned their hero. People in Australia lowered flags in his honor. Australian officers suggested they hold a state funeral. The Irwin family talked it over and politely declared Steve would want to be remembered as an ordinary bloke. His father, Bob, said. Instead, a memorable service was held in the Australian Zoo Croc Zoo. All 5,500 seats were filled. Chapter 10, Remembering Steve. Steve Irwin devoted his life to protecting the natural world and wildlife. His TV shows help people understand why preserving an animal's habitat was so important. Steve and Terry used the money to buy large areas of land throughout Australia. But there was one place that Steve loved more than almost any other, the Wenlock River wetlands. Rare plants and animals thrive there. It was Steve's dream to protect this wild area from building and mining. After his death, the Australian government announced that 34,000 acres of land Steve loved would be protected forever. Miners and builders would never disturb it. The Steve Irwin Wildlife Reserve would be looked after by the Australian Zoo. Steve Irwin's workers continued to be honored. In 2007, the government of Rwanda in Africa named the baby mountain gorilla in Steve's honor. In 2009, Queensland Museum named a rare species of tree snail after Steve. The snail is called the Crickety Steve Irwin. The snail's tail is yellow, orange, and brown bands remind scientists of Steve's cocky uniform. Each year, on November 15th, wildlife warriors all over the world celebrate Steve Irwin's Day. Terry and Bindi Robert are continuing Steve's work at the zoo. They help care for the animals. They share their passion for the wildlife with visitors. In 2012, Bindi and Robert filmed a 24-episode internet show, Growing Up Wild, helped kids around the world understand the danger and beauty of wild animals. Steve's memory lives on the zoo he created and the wildlife he protected. No one will ever forget his passion, his dedications in his mind. Wild animals are gorgeous, he said. Respect them. It's their planet too. Hi, and I am so grateful that you listened all the way to the end of Who Was Steve Irwin. I hope you have a good rest of your day, but before we go, I'd like to give a big thank you to you because you're helping, and I hope you're helping wildlife. See you around. Bye.